few days ago, on 9th of December, a group of 56 senior scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence, who, like academics, disagree on much, all agreed on a statement on the mass violence in Israel and Palestine since 7th of October. I signed that statement as well. There is evidence, the scholars wrote, of, quote, a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack that the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines as a crime against humanity. Moreover, they added, dozens of statements of Israeli leaders, ministers in the war cabinet, and senior army officers since 7th of October, that is, people with command authority, suggest, quote, an intent to destroy Palestinians as such in the language of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We should take seriously the professional position and the warning of dozens of senior scholars who have devoted their lives to studying mass violence, including genocide. We should also take seriously, as they ask to do, what Israeli leaders have said since 7th of October, not only, as has been argued in the first week after the Hamas attack, the mass murder of 1,200 Israelis and migrant workers, and the taking of around 240 hostages, but repeatedly by different people with command authority using various rationalizations. Israeli President Isaac Herzog used particularly loaded language in an interview on MSNBC just last week, for instance, on 5th of December, and I quote him, "This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas," he said in response to a question about the high level of killings of Palestinians in Israel's attack on Gaza. This is already significant, an admission that the attack is not only against Hamas. It's a war, he continued, that is intended really, truly, to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the Middle East. And if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. End of quote. Herzog builds on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's infamous association in late October and early November of Israel's attack on Gaza with a biblical story of Amalek. This is a story of the Israelites destroying completely an enemy perceived as the ultimate evil, Amalek. But Herzog places it on a modern scale as the last stand against global apocalypse and the demise, quote, of Western civilization. Herzog thus expressed a colonial rationalization of destruction of people under colonial occupation, but here taken to extreme. Israel's use of images and videos of the Hamas mass murder on 7th of October to justify its destructive assault on Gaza operates within this colonial framework. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Galant set the tone for this on 9th of October when he proclaimed, quote, total siege on Gaza in a fight against, in his words, human animals. If it remained unclear whether Galant was describing only Hamas militants in this way or all Palestinians in Gaza, Israeli coordinator of government activities in the territories, Major General Hassan Aliyan, clarified it in the next day in his video message to the people of Gaza, and I quote him, Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. Human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. So quite explicit and direct. Colonial attacks against colonized people assumed a war against, quote, savages, where laws of war between civilized people, that is, white Europeans, do not apply. This colonial common sense led to brutal and indeed genocidal counterinsurgency campaigns by colonial armies. This happened, for instance, when the German occupiers suppressed an uprising by the Herero in Southwest Africa from 1904 to 1907 through genocidal warfare. The German military commander there, General Lothar von Trotha, issued, quote, an extermination order and proceeded to implement it, so that by 1907, the German colonizers had killed 65,000 Herero, 80% of the population, together with 10,000 Nama. This practice of casting an entire civilian population as enemies, as legitimate military targets, is a common genocidal mechanism. Thus, Israeli President Herzog's words in a press conference on 13th of October that, quote, it is an entire nation out there, Palestinians in Gaza, that is responsible for the Hamas attack, that quote should have set off alarms. History is again instructive here. Hutu authorities in Rwanda, for example, identified all the Tutsis with the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the rebel Tutsi army that had invaded Rwanda from Uganda in 1990, which led to the Rwanda genocide in 1994. The Israeli authorities and the Israeli army have acted according to this genocidal intent in the last 2 months. This is the reason for the unprecedented level of mass killings. Now, with over 18,000 Palestinians that Israel's assault has killed in just a bit more than 2 months, with more than 7,000 of them children and youth, and of course thousands buried under the rubble, an unknown number, and we heard the data from Jihad. But, quote, killing members of the group and causing serious bodily or mental harm, the first 2 acts of genocide in the UN Genocide Convention, are not the only ones that Israel is perpetrating now in Gaza. It is the 3rd act of the convention, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, that mostly fits Israeli mass violence in Gaza now. The total siege measures, together with a forced displacement of over 1.8 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, have indeed created in the southern part of the Strip severe overcrowding with a risk of outbreak of infectious diseases, exacerbated by acute shortages of food, clean water, fuel, and medical supplies. All along, moreover, the Israeli army pushes Palestinians into an increasingly shrinking area in what is to begin with one of the most densely populated areas in the world. We saw on 13th of October the, quote, evacuation order that Israel issued from the north to the south of Gaza, and now from the east to west, from Khan Yunis to Rafah. The Israeli army has also bombed Palestinians moving, fleeing to safe areas, or already in areas Israel designated as safe, so that, as one Palestinian put it in a post on social media on 1st of December, when Israel resumed its attack following the ceasefire, and I quote here, we are left with one option, to accept death. It doesn't matter if we move or not, any minute now is our last. They say leave Khan Yunis for Rafah, then strike Rafah. We have nowhere to go. If we die, at least we die in the house, not out on the streets. Israeli Minister Avi Dichter, a member of the War Cabinet, described openly on Israeli TV the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as, quote, the Gaza Nakba, referencing the mass deportations of 750,000 Palestinians during the 1948 war and the creation of Israel, which also included massacres and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns. Forced displacement, what is more commonly called ethnic cleansing, is not in itself an act of genocide, but we know that historically it has figured in genocidal processes. Indeed, a process of pushing unwanted people into designated areas that eventually escalated into genocide characterized the Holocaust. It took the Nazis 2.5 years into the war of experimenting with various schemes of forced displacement of Jews from fall 1939 to spring 1942 to reach the final version of, quote, the final solution of the Jewish question. It is also important to mention the language we are hearing in Israel about deporting Palestinians in Gaza to the Sinai Desert. This is now a common idea in Israeli politics and society. This was laid out first in a document prepared by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry on 13th of October, and it was articulated by various politicians and ministers, such as Dichter's comments on the Gaza Nakba. Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu's version from 5th of November is particularly noteworthy. He repeated Israeli President Herzog's rationale that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, that Palestinians in Gaza are actually, in his words, Nazis and monsters, and that they, quote, can go to Ireland or deserts. This is extremely alarming, as deserts have been used historically as weapons of genocide. For instance, when the German colonial occupiers in German Southwest Africa, which I mentioned, chased the Herero and Nama into the desert, where they died en masse from hunger and dehydration. The idea to remove all the Palestinians in Gaza explains why Israel's attack there targets everything, including universities, schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, and also, importantly, bakeries and agricultural fields. This very much fits the total siege aim of creating severe food insecurity, malnutrition, and hunger conditions for Palestinians in Gaza. The bombing of agricultural fields also demonstrates that Israel does not intend for Palestinians to be able to return to live in Gaza. A recent video that circulated widely on social media, created by Israeli soldiers in the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza on Friday, 8th of December, shows them setting fire to a truck with food and water in it. How they describe what they are doing is horribly revealing, and I quote the soldiers. "It is the second candle of Hanukkah. We are in a factory of candy that is given to children who carry out terror attacks. We are bringing the light to this dark place, burning it until there remains no remnant of it." It is not at all by coincidence that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a message to Israelis 3 days earlier, on 5th of December, that, quote, "This week we will light the first candle of Hanukkah. Our soldiers will bring light to the darkness in the alleyways of Gaza, in the ruins of Sajaiya, in the terrorist lairs in Khan Yunis. The lights together as a great light will cleave the darkness." But these soldiers could take inspiration from the widespread incitement to genocide in Israeli media, politics, and public spaces from the 7th of October. They have very likely heard members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, call, quote, to burn Gaza now completely, no less, as the ruling Likud party member Nissim Vaturi did on social media on 17th of November. And they have most probably heard politicians reaffirm Israeli President Herzog that, quote, "There are no innocent people in Gaza, including the 1.1 people who are children and youth there," as Knesset member Avigdor Lieberman did on social media on 1st of December. They may have also read Israeli journalist David Mizrahi Weltheim, who wrote on social media on 7th of October that, and I quote, "If all the captives are not returned immediately, turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. If a hair falls from their head, execute security prisoners. Violate all norms on the way to victory." Weltheim also added, "We are fighting human animals." That was 2 days before Galant used it in his total siege proclamation. 4 days later, another Israeli journalist, Roy Sharon, commented on social media, quote, that if in order to finally eliminate the military capabilities of Hamas, we need 1 million bodies, then let there be 1 million bodies. That is yet an example of how the slippage between targeting Hamas and targeting Palestinians is expressed. Annihilatory language has also appeared in public spaces in Israel, such as banners on the bridges in Tel Aviv that call, quote, to annihilate Gaza and explain that, quote, "The picture of triumph is 0 people in Gaza." There are dozens and dozens of examples of incitement in Israeli media, which recalls the media incitement to genocide in Rwanda as genocide was unfolding there in 1994, which led, it is worth reminding everyone, to the media case when journalists were put on trial and convicted in the ICTR, the post-genocide trials, of incitement to genocide, which is a separate crime under Article 3 of the UN Genocide Convention. Genocide, then, has become normalized in Israeli media, society, and politics today. State leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers proclaim their intent openly to a society that is receptive and even encouraging. And the soldiers and officers in the Israeli army understand this very well. For them, too, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Palestinian children are terrorists, and the Israeli army needs to, quote, burn Gaza until no remnant remains of it. The 56 scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence who signed a statement on 9th of December wrote that, quote, the time for concerted action to prevent genocide is now, warning also that, quote, should the Israeli attack continue, Palestinians under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Palestinian citizens of Israel face grave danger as well. It is our urgent responsibility and is the obligation of states under Article 1 of the UN Genocide Convention to heed this warning and act now to stop and prevent genocide. Thank you.